I stepped out of the taxi and my boots sank into the 6-inch layer of fresh snow. The icy wind in Aspen, Colorado slapped my face, forcing me to pull the collar of my wool coat tighter. After decades as a professional ski instructor, I thought I was used to the cold, but this Christmas Eve chill, a biting 32 degrees, made me shiver. I stood in front of my daughter's house, a magnificent modern chalet, its warm lights spilling onto the pristine snow. I felt a swirl of excitement and nerves. I wanted to surprise Sarah. I wanted to see my little girl's radiant smile when her mom showed up unannounced. After so many months away coaching in Switzerland, my heart ached for her. The front yard was buried in snow, not a single footprint marring the perfect white blanket. Through the massive picture window, I could see the glow of the living room. A soaring fireplace crackled merrily, and cheerful Christmas music drifted into the night. I heard Jingle Bells, Sarah's favorite as a child. I stepped closer, peering inside. A long table was draped in a festive red cloth, laden with a feast: a golden roasted turkey, steaming platters of stuffing, a glistening cranberry salad. And there, gathered around the fire, was the entire Crawford family, my son-in-law's folks. I recognized Mr. Arthur Crawford, Ryan's father, holding court with a glass of whiskey. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, his mother, held a champagne flute, a smug smile on her lips. Ryan's sister Brenda was there too, with her 2 young children, laughing loudly. They were all raising their glasses, toasting. But where was Sarah? I frowned, scanning the room, thinking perhaps she was in the kitchen. I'd pictured her smiling, chatting, like in the old days. Then I heard it. A faint sound, a whimper, coming from the shadows of the wide, wraparound porch. I turned, and my heart stopped. Under the dim porch light, next to a planter filled with snow-covered poinsettias, Sarah was curled up in an old wooden rocking chair. She wore only a thin blouse and leggings. Her frail shoulders were shaking uncontrollably. Her messy hair stuck to her forehead, damp with melted snow. I ran to her, my heart pounding like a drum. "Sarah!" I shouted, my voice breaking. I ripped off my heavy coat and wrapped it around her, my trembling hands touching her arms. They were ice cold. She lifted her face, her eyes red-rimmed and vacant, her lips pale and cracked. "Mom?" Her voice was so faint it almost dissolved in the wind. She collapsed against my shoulder, a dead weight. I hugged her tightly, feeling her body shake like a small, broken bird. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here," I whispered, trying to sound calm, though hot tears of rage burned my eyes. I pulled an extra sweater from my carry-on bag and wrapped it around her legs, trying to force some of my warmth into her. I lifted her into my arms. Her slippers, soaked and frozen, fell off, landing silently in the snow. I held her close, feeling her weak, shallow breath against my neck. In that moment, all I wanted was to get her out of there. But then, from inside the house, the laughter continued, careless and cruel. I clearly heard Ryan's deep voice, my son-in-law, smug and boastful. The whole table erupted in laughter, and the clinking of glasses sounded like a vile, mocking chorus. They were cozy by the fire, while my daughter, my only child, was freezing to death on their porch. Just a few hours ago, I was at the Denver airport, still feeling the burn in my thighs from a week of high-altitude training. I dragged my old suitcase, my heart racing with anticipation, imagining Sarah's face lighting up when I showed up unannounced on Christmas Eve. She had always been my light. Ever since she was a little girl, clinging to my legs, begging for one more story, growing into a sweet young woman whose smile could melt the toughest days. My job as a world-class ski coach took me away Europe, South America, chasing the snow. Every time I left, I told myself, just one more season, then I'll be with her. And now I was here, ready for the reunion I dreamed of. I'd sat in the airport lounge, waiting for the short connecting flight to Aspen, and pulled out my phone to call her. I wanted to hear her voice. The phone rang, and rang, and rang. No answer. I frowned, a knot of unease tightening in my chest. I tried again, and again. Always silence. I sent a text. "Mom's on her way, sweetie. Are you home?" I stared at the screen. Nothing. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself she was just busy, decorating the tree, cooking with her new family. The plane landed in Aspen after dark. I dragged my suitcase out into the sharp, crystalline air. Families were hugging, laughing. A father carried his little girl on his shoulders, her pink snowsuit a bright splash of color. I'd carried Sarah like that. I flagged a taxi, my loneliness a physical ache. "Take me to 12th Street, Meadow Creek," I said, my voice hoarse. On the way, the streets were packed with people heading to Christmas Eve services. I stared out the window at the warm lights glowing from the massive chalets. Church bells rang faintly in the distance. I smiled, picturing Sarah making the mashed potatoes I'd taught her, her secret ingredient, a touch of cream cheese. As we neared her house, I asked the driver to stop a block away. I wanted to surprise her. I grabbed my suitcase and walked through the silent, snow-covered path, my boots leaving deep prints. I heard a guitar and singing coming from the house. I smiled. Sarah, singing Winter Wonderland. I left my suitcase on the step and was about to knock. But then, a sharp, mocking laugh cut through the music. I froze. Mr. Arthur Crawford's voice boomed, clear as the cold air. "That's what you get for marrying damaged goods, Ryan. A woman who can't even have a baby. 4 miscarriages. Hasn't she embarrassed us enough?" His laugh was heavy, dripping with contempt. Then, Ryan's voice. "My son-in-law. Cold and cruel. She's always faking that depression, locking herself in her room to do nothing. If it weren't for my parents, I'd have kicked her out ages ago." Another laugh erupted. I heard Brenda, Ryan's sister, her tone venomous. "Exactly. Useless. A wife who can't have kids. What's she good for? Pretending to be sick just to get coddled. It's pathetic." Each word was a stab. I stood paralyzed, my breath catching in my throat. 4 miscarriages. 4 times she had called me, sobbing, her voice breaking. And now they said she was faking it. And that's when I saw her, curled up in the chair on the porch, shivering. My heart stopped. I scooped her into my arms. Her body was a block of ice. My hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from a white-hot rage that threatened to consume me. I pounded on the door. No one came. I banged harder, the sound thudding against the wood, absorbed by the cheerful music. I gritted my teeth. I stepped back, shifted Sarah's weight in my arms, and kicked the door. My heavy winter boot connected with the lock. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with a crack that finally silenced the music. Mrs. Eleanor Crawford, Ryan's mother, stood there, a glass of red wine wobbling in her hand, her bright red lipstick, a perfect, surprised "oh." "Well, Catherine," she said, her voice syrupy and fake. "What a surprise. Why didn't you let us know you were coming?" I locked eyes with her. "Let you know?" I growled. "If I'd let you know, how would I have seen this? What have you done to my daughter?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, glancing at Sarah in my arms with a grimace, as if she were looking at something distasteful. "Emily just wanted some fresh air," she said, her tone laced with contempt. "Don't make a big deal, Catherine. It's Christmas. Come in." Before I could respond, Ryan appeared. His shirt was unbuttoned, his face flushed with wine. He shot me a defiant, arrogant look. "Mom, close the door," he said. "Let her stay out there. Who shows up to Christmas dinner, acting all fragile just to get out of helping?" He chuckled. Those words were another knife. I felt Sarah shrink in my arms. Brenda's voice rang out. "Exactly. A woman who can't even carry a baby to term. What is she worth? Useless." My face flushed. I shouldered my way past Eleanor, kicking the door shut behind me. The bang echoed. The room fell silent. I stalked into the center of the living room, still holding Sarah, leaving a trail of melted snow. Every eye was on me. Arthur, his face cold. Eleanor, her fake smile gone. Brenda, her eyes full of disdain. I gently laid Sarah on the plush sofa, draping my scarf over her. Her hands were still icy. I knelt, looking into her eyes, trying to give her my strength. Ryan stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "You don't get to make a scene in my house, Catherine." I stood up, pointing a trembling finger at his face. Your house? And you think you have the right to throw my daughter out into the cold? To let her nearly freeze to death? Is that what you call a husband? Is that what you call family? Mr. Arthur Crawford rose slowly from his chair, adjusting his suit. That's enough, Mrs. Ross, he said, his voice booming with judicial authority. This is a family matter. A woman who cannot bear children needs to learn to endure. That is just the way it is. You feast, I said, my voice shaking with rage, while my daughter is outside in 32-degree weather? No coat? No food? That's what you call humanity? A woman who can't have kids, even if she eats, is just a waste, Eleanor said softly, taking a sip of wine. Brenda chimed in. Your daughter always uses depression as an excuse. Has she ever cooked a decent meal for this family? All she does is lie in bed whining. A faint voice came from the couch. I'm so tired, Sarah stammered, her voice barely audible. No one understands. Enough, Ryan barked. Shut up! You've embarrassed me enough already. He took a step toward her. I moved between them. My mind flashed back Sarah calling me, sobbing, after each miscarriage. And now Ryan, her husband, dared to say she'd done it on purpose. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hand was steady. I dialed 911. I'm calling the police, I said, my voice cold as the mountain air. This isn't a family matter. This is domestic abuse. Ryan froze. You wouldn't dare. Watch me, I said. You have no idea who you're challenging, Catherine. Mr. Crawford said, his voice a low threat. I have sat on the bench in this state for 30 years. You think a phone call will make us tremble? Go ahead. Make the call, Brenda sneered. Let's see who they believe. A crazy old lady or a respected family like ours? Mom, please, Sarah whispered, tugging at my sleeve. Don't. I just want peace. I looked at her, my heart breaking. I squeezed her hand. You don't have to be afraid, I said firmly. I will protect you. I held the phone to my ear. Yes, hello? I need to report a case of domestic abuse and endangerment. As I spoke, I saw a flicker of movement outside the picture window. A man in a police uniform, standing silently on the porch. He'd been patrolling the wealthy, empty neighborhood. He'd seen me. He'd heard everything. I recognized him. Jake, a former student from my taekwondo days, a kid I'd kept out of trouble. He gave me a slight nod, his hand resting on his radio. I nodded back. I wasn't alone. Ryan, seeing the officer, seeing my resolve, finally lost his composure. Get out, he roared. This is my house. Get out, or things will get worse. I clenched my fists. The air in the room was electric. I looked at Ryan, his face red, his eyes full of hate. I looked at Arthur, his arrogance unshaken. I looked at Eleanor and Brenda, their faces twisted with contempt. You think you can threaten me? I said. You think you can hurt my daughter and pay no price? You're wrong. All of you. You're going to pay for what you did to Sarah. The silence in the room was a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. I placed my hand on Sarah's shoulder, her frail body still trembling. This isn't just a family matter anymore, I said, my voice steady. This is domestic abuse, and I am pressing charges. Eleanor, Ryan's mother, let out a high, tinkling laugh, a sound like breaking glass. Abuse? She drawled, swirling the red wine in her glass. We are simply teaching her what her place is, Catherine. You should be thanking us for putting up with her this long. Ryan stepped closer, his eyes bloodshot, his words slurring slightly from the champagne. She fakes it, all of it. The depression, the pain. No one is hitting her. We're just sick of her uselessness. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could hear. You know, Catherine, I've been thinking. Nobody loses 4 pregnancies in a row. It's not natural. Maybe she did it on purpose. Those words. They were a razor, aimed directly at Sarah's soul. I heard her breath catch in a sharp, wounded gasp. I remembered the calls, her voice broken. Mom, I lost it again. I lost the baby. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms. Ryan, her husband, the man who was supposed to protect her, was accusing her of the unthinkable. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hand was shaking, but I quickly dialed the local precinct. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice cold as the snow outside. "A report will be filed. You will answer to the law." Ryan froze, the smirk wiped from his face. You wouldn't dare." Mr. Arthur Crawford, who had been watching with a cold, judicial expression, finally stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket, his voice booming with authority. "You have no idea who you are challenging, Mrs. Ross. I have sat on the bench in this state for 30 years. I have seen the worst this world has to offer. You think a simple phone call will make us tremble?" His eyes were sharp, a clear, cold threat. Brenda, from the table, crossed her arms and sneered. "Go ahead, make the call. Let's see who they believe. A crazy, hysterical old woman, or a respected family like ours." Sarah, still on the couch, tugged at my sleeve. Her voice was a terrified whisper. "Mom, please don't. I just want peace. It will only make it worse." I looked at her, my heart aching. I squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be afraid," I said firmly. "I will protect you." I lifted her in my arms. The snow from her clothes and soaked slippers fell onto the priceless rug. I ignored the gasps of the family. As I turned toward the door, I saw him again. Jake! He was no longer on the porch. He had stepped silently into the foyer, his hand on his radio, his eyes burning with a fire I recognized. He was ready to act. I gave him a slight nod. He nodded back, a silent promise. I walked out of that house, leaving them in their fortress of cruelty. Behind me, I heard Eleanor shriek at a housekeeper to clean the floor. I heard Ryan slam his hand on the table. And I heard Arthur's deep, angry voice, barking into his own phone, calling his own contacts. I took Sarah to my small apartment, the one I kept near the training center. It was simple, but it was safe. I settled her on the bed, wrapped her in my thickest blankets, and made her a mug of hot, sweet cocoa. She just stared at it, her eyes empty. My phone rang. It was Jake. "Mrs. Ross," he said, his voice deep and steady. "I filed the initial report at the station. Domestic disturbance, endangerment, but they're not going to make this easy. The Whitlocks have a lot of pull." "I'm ready to testify, Jake," I said, my voice brief. "I know, Coach," he said. "I've got your back." The next morning, I took Sarah to a therapist, Dr. Linda Carter, an older woman with kind eyes. After speaking with Sarah, she looked at me, her voice heavy. "She's suffering from severe clinical depression, Mrs. Ross. The trauma of 4 miscarriages, compounded by what sounds like constant emotional and psychological abuse, has crushed her. She needs rest, treatment, and above all, to feel safe." I nodded, my heart a leaden weight. That afternoon, Jake stopped by, out of uniform. He was carrying a bag of groceries and some old art supplies. He set them gently in front of Sarah. I remember you used to like to draw," he said, his voice hesitant. I thought, maybe, just starting small, might make you feel better. Sarah looked at the blank paper, her head bowed. "Thanks," she murmured, "but I don't think I can do anything anymore." Jake's face fell, but he just nodded. He left the supplies on the table. That night, as Sarah slept, I sat at my small kitchen table, organizing. I gathered every bank receipt, every wire transfer I had sent to Sarah over the years, for the house, for the baby, just because, thousands of dollars. Money that Ryan and his family had, I now realized, squandered. As I was sorting, a thick envelope was shoved under my door. No knock, just a silent, sinister threat. I opened it. Inside, a single, handwritten note in messy block letters. "Don't mess with the Crawford family. Give up, or you'll end up as miserable as your daughter." The threat didn't scare me. It fueled me. They thought I would back down. They were wrong. The weeks preparing for the trial were a living nightmare. I sat at that kitchen table every night, reviewing bank statements, medical records, Those cold black and white numbers were the only proof I had of my love and of their cruelty. Finally, the first day of the trial arrived. I felt like I was stepping onto the mat for the biggest fight of my life. I held Sarah's hand as we entered the Aspen courthouse. Her fingers were icy. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She kept her head down. The Crawfords were already there. Ryan, in a sharp gray suit, adjusting his tie, shot us a scornful glance. Eleanor, his mother, sat perfectly upright, a confident smile on her face. Mr. Arthur Crawford stood behind his son, his presence imposing, his gaze hard. Jake was in the spectator section, in uniform. He gave me a slight, steady nod. The trial began. My lawyer, a friend from my coaching days, presented the evidence. The bank transfers, the therapist's detailed report. He spoke of the miscarriages, the depression, the abuse. Then, the Whitlock, the Crawford lawyers stood up, and the world turned upside down. Emily's, Sarah's, just faking it. Their young, shark-like lawyer said, "She's faking her illness to be coddled. The Crawford family gave her everything. She simply failed as a wife." They called a witness. Mrs. Martha, the Crawfords' former housekeeper. She took the stand, her eyes darting nervously. Mrs. Sarah?" She was lazy. She stammered. She'd lock herself in her room all day. I had to do all the cooking, all the cleaning. I couldn't believe my ears. Sarah, who loved to cook, who made pies from scratch. Lazy? I shot to my feet. "You're lying. She was never like that." Silence. The judge, a middle-aged man with an expressionless face, slammed his gavel. "Or I'll have you removed." I sat down, my heart pounding. I glanced at Arthur Crawford. He was smiling, a subtle, smug nod. To the judge, an invisible thread. My skin went cold. They had planned this. It was all fixed. My lawyer, seeing the shift, pressed on. "Your Honor, we would like to present key evidence. A recording from Christmas Eve, capturing the Crawford family's psychological abuse." He played the audio Jake had secretly recorded from the porch. Ryan's voice, "She's faking depression to dodge her duties." Eleanor's voice, "A woman who can't have kids is useless." Brenda's voice, "She can't even manage to give birth." The courtroom fell silent. I saw the jury members shift, their faces tight with disgust. But the Crawfords' lawyer was on his feet. "Objection! This recording was made illegally, without my client's consent. It is inadmissible." The judge nodded, his voice dry. "The recording is inadmissible." I felt the ground open up. The clearest, most damning proof gone. Sarah hid her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I looked at Jake. His head was bowed, his fists trembling. Arthur Crawford sat there, his gaze calm and arrogant. He had known this would happen. The trial was a sham. After a week, the final verdict came. I sat, holding Sarah's hand, her fingers limp in mine. The judge entered, his face blank. "The court grants the divorce," he said, his voice monotone. "However, the court does not recognize the claims of domestic abuse due to insufficient legal evidence. As for the division of assets, as Mr. Crawford contributed more to the marriage's upkeep, the court awards him the majority of shared property." The words hit me like a sledgehammer. No recognition of abuse, insufficient evidence. I looked at Arthur. He had done this. He had pulled the strings. I couldn't hold back. "This is unfair," I shouted, my voice breaking. "This isn't justice. You saw what they did." "Order!" The judge slammed his gavel. "Order, or I'll have you removed." I sat, shaking with rage, as Ryan turned to look at me. He flashed a mocking, triumphant smile and adjusted his tie. Eleanor and Brenda giggled, a sound like spiders in my ear. Ryan sauntered over, his posture smug. He leaned close to my ear, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "See, Catherine? I told you. Don't fight me. You're just a useless old woman." His words were the final spark. My blood, my taekwondo training, my years of discipline, all of it erupted in a single, uncontainable surge. I clenched my fist, my body tensing. I was going to hit him. I was going to break that arrogant face. I took a step, but suddenly Jake was there, a blue wall in front of me. His own eyes were blazing, his fists clenched. I saw my own fury mirrored in him. "What, you gonna hit me?" Ryan taunted, stepping closer, certain Jake wouldn't dare. A low-life cop in a courtroom? Jake's fist trembled. But then Sarah broke free from my arm. She ran to Jake and clung to his arm, sobbing, her voice a broken wail that tore through the room. "No, please. Don't do it. I don't want you. I don't want Mom. I don't want you to be violent like him. I just want to go home." Her cry silenced the room. Camera flashes, which had begun to pop, illuminated her small, trembling form. Jake froze, his breathing heavy, his fist, trembling with rage, slowly uncurled. Ryan, seeing he had won, just adjusted his tie, turned, and walked away, his family following like a royal procession. The room emptied, leaving just me, Sarah, and Jake. 3 people, drowning in the bitter taste of injustice. "Mom," Sarah whispered, her body shaking. I'm so tired. Can we just go home?" I looked at her, my daughter, so utterly broken. I had lost. But as I held her, as Jake stood beside us, his gaze steady, I knew this wasn't an end. It was a declaration of war. In the days after, Boise seemed to hold its breath. But then the tide turned. The local news, which had been covering the trial of the prominent Crawford family, started to change its tune. Headlines appeared: "Justice bought in Crawford divorce? Judge's ruling sparks outrage." The video of Sarah, sobbing, clinging to Jake in the courtroom, had gone viral. The image of my daughter, her voice breaking, begging for peace, had done what our evidence could not. It had touched the public's heart. Comments flooded social media. "The Crawfords think they can control everything. That poor woman. She deserves better." The Whitlocks, the Crawfords, had won the legal battle, but they were losing the war of public opinion. I heard whispers that Arthur's colleagues were shunning him. Ryan, now dubbed the bully of Boise, became a pariah. The family's pristine reputation was crumbling. I brought Sarah to my small apartment. It was her sanctuary. Each morning, I made her breakfast. She would sit, cradling a mug of tea, staring out the window. Some days, silent tears would roll down her cheeks, but she was healing. Jake became our rock. He'd stop by, sometimes with a small bouquet of wildflowers, sometimes with donuts. Each visit, Sarah's eyes seemed a little brighter. One afternoon, he brought her a small, carved wooden keychain. It was a taekwondo figure, a symbol of strength. "You don't have to be strong all at once," he said, his voice gentle. "But you can start over." Sarah took the keychain, her eyes shining. She nodded. "Thank you, Jake," she whispered. One evening, I was in the kitchen, pretending to wash dishes. Sarah and Jake were on the sofa. Her voice was trembling. "Jake, I might never be able to have kids. If that disappoints you." My heart stopped. Jake smiled, a warm, steady smile. He took her hands. "I don't need that, Sarah," he said, his voice so full of love it made my own eyes blur. You're my family." I turned away, letting my own tears fall, my heart full of a gratitude too big for words. For years, Sarah had been told she was a failure. Now, someone was telling her she was enough. Easter came. I took Sarah to the town square, like we used to. The square was full of laughter and the smell of fresh-baked pies. Sarah, in a light spring sweater, was smiling. A real smile. "Mom," she said, "I miss this. I miss making apple pie with you." "We will," I said, squeezing her hand. "We'll make more memories." As we sat on a bench, a profound truth settled over me. Justice in a courtroom can be bought, but the justice of the heart, love, respect, resilience, that no one can touch. Jake showed up with a bag of warm churros, and they laughed. 2 old friends, 2 survivors. I watched them, my heart full. Sarah's scars would never fully fade, but she was learning to live again. I had been a coach all my life, a fighter. But I knew this fight, the one for my daughter's happiness, was the only one that had ever truly mattered. This story, though fictionalized, is a reminder that even when the system fails, human kindness and courage can prevail. The law may be blind, but the heart sees everything.